They were live streaming again Nina with her polished voice and perfectly angled camera, capturing the warm glow of sunset over the cedar deck. "Welcome to our coastal sanctuary," she said sweetly, gesturing behind her. "And this," she paused for just a second, turning slightly toward me. "This is Lillian. She used to help my mom when I was little. She's kind of like a longtime helper of the family." I didn't flinch. Not at first. I just stood there, holding the tray of lemon water I had prepared, wearing the apron Nina had left folded on the kitchen counter with a tag that read, "For staff use only." I placed the glasses gently on the table, careful not to make a sound that might interrupt the performance. Behind the screen, hearts floated up. Viewers commented things like, "What a beautiful home, and you're so lucky to have such amazing support." I watched David laugh at something Nina said, the way his hand rested on her shoulder. The same shoulder he used to cry into when he failed his first college final. He didn't correct her, didn't say, "That's my mom," didn't say anything, just smiled. The walls of that house, every beam, every floorboard. I had chosen them. I had paid for them. I had poured myself into that cottage like it was a child being born, carved from grief and rebuilt with every dollar I saved after his father died. And now, I was a helper, not a guest, not a parent, not even a person with a name. Just part of the background, a piece of the coastal aesthetic. I stood there with my hands folded, unsure whether I should go back into the kitchen or simply disappear into the frame like a shadow. No one told me where I belonged, but they made it very clear where I didn't. They didn't call me the wrong name. They just stopped calling me Mom. He was 8 when it happened. David, my boy. The morning his father left for work in the city and didn't come back. There was rain. Not the kind that washes things clean, but the kind that clings to your skin, heavy and cold, like grief before it has a name. I remember kneeling in the hallway, clutching his backpack, trying to explain what accident meant to a child who still believed scraped knees were the worst pain the world could offer. He didn't cry. He just stared at the floor, then at me, and said, "So it's just us now." I nodded. "Yes, it's just us." And that became the rhythm of our life. Just us. I gave up everything that didn't lead back to him. I left the firm. Architecture had been my calling, but dreams didn't pay for groceries or buy warmth in a drafty house. I took a teaching job at the local school, packed away my portfolios, and moved us to a rented cottage by the bay. It had no insulation and creaked like an old ship in the wind, but we made it ours. We had bunk beds. He insisted I sleep below him so he could protect me. He was so small, then knees full of bruises, questions too big for his age. At night, after he'd fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the light off to save electricity, sketching blueprints on the backs of used paper, still drawing, always dreaming. I couldn't let that part of me die. Not completely. David grew slowly into himself, kind-hearted, observant, a boy who noticed when my shoes wore out or when I skipped dinner. He'd quietly put food from his plate onto mine. We planted marigolds in empty cans, repaired secondhand furniture, learned to find magic in the mundane. On his 15th birthday, I pawned my mother's ring to buy him a used bike. The look on his face when he rode down that gravel path. "I can still see it," he said. "We're unstoppable, Mom." And I believed him. When he got a scholarship to a university in Halifax, I cried not because he was leaving, but because he was becoming everything I had hoped. The day he moved out, I tucked a blueprint into his suitcase, the dream house I'd been designing for over a decade. He didn't know then that it was for him. When he met Nina, I smiled. She was ambitious, put together, the kind of woman who walked like the world owed her answers. David looked at her the way he used to look at the stars, like they held something sacred. I told myself, let him follow the light. After their wedding, I decided the time had come. I cashed out the annuity. I sold the small piece of land left to me in Pictou County. I even dipped into my emergency fund quietly, without telling anyone. I found a patch of land along the Nova Scotia coast, where the sun hit the cliffs just right and the ocean whispered through the trees. And then I built. Not with machines or contractors. I hired 2 local carpenter's men who drank coffee with me at dawn and let me carry beams when my hands shook from age but not from doubt. I knew every nail in that house, every hinge, every floorboard. I chose each window frame with care, made sure the kitchen caught the morning light. I even added a loft with a skylight, because David used to love lying on the roof and naming constellations. It took 15 months. When it was done, I handed him the key. He blinked, holding it like it was breakable. "It's yours," I said softly. "All of it. The deed, the land, the house. I'm not on any of it." He shook his head, eyes shining. "You can't do that, Mom." But I had already done it. He hugged me so tight my ribs ached. "You're the foundation of this house," he whispered. "I'll never forget that." For a while, he didn't. I was invited to dinners. Nina smiled. Gloria, her mother, didn't say much, but David always made sure there was a chair for me. I didn't expect gratitude, I just wanted warmth. I helped them decorate. I brought jars of jam I had made from our old backyard plums. I fixed the porch railing one weekend when it splintered. They joked that I knew the house better than anyone, and I did because it was stitched together with the story of us. I didn't build it for recognition. I built it so that when winter came, whether outside or within, he'd never feel the cold like I once did. But I hadn't planned for a different kind of winter. One that creeps in not through broken windows, but through forgetfulness, through silence, through a quiet shift where warmth becomes performance and presence becomes inconvenience. I didn't see it then. I still believed the house would remember me, if not in name. Then in the way it breathed when doors opened or in how the sea shimmered through its windows. I didn't build the house to have my name on it. I just wanted a place to return to when there was nowhere else I belonged. It didn't happen all at once. No one slammed a door or raised a voice or drew a line in the sand. That's the cruel thing about distance, it doesn't walk in loud. It creeps in quietly, like fog around the corners of a house you thought was sealed. At first, it was small things I told myself not to notice. The family photos Nina began posting on her blog, always warm, glowing, carefully curated, but always with 3 people, David, Nina, and Gloria. No trace of me. "It's just branding," David said when I asked, gently. "You know how online stuff works? Mom, simpler is better." I nodded. Of course. Simpler. When I visited, Nina would hand me a list of things to pick up from the market: lemons, herbs, oat milk, not rude, not harsh. "Just assuming you know where everything is," she'd say without looking up from her phone. And I did. I had designed the pantry layout. I had planned the counter height for Nina's frame based on her posture the first time I met her. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I kept things stocked, kept the compost taken out, kept quiet during filming hours. Nina's blog, The Cross Wellness, started to grow rapidly. She hosted weekly mindful meals on live stream, sharing recipes, home tips, lifestyle mantras. David sometimes joined her, smiling gently in the background. Gloria always had a seat at the table, her hair done, her posture sharp, her voice smooth. She spoke of intention, of grace, of generational wisdom. "My daughter gets her strength from the women before her," she'd say into the camera. I would watch from the side, wiping the edge of the sink, wondering what it was like to be one of those women. Then came the candle collaboration. Nina created a scent called Rooted Grace Inspired, she said, by the women who raised her. The label bore a stylized sketch of Gloria in her youth. David looked uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. I almost laughed. I had once taught David how to mix beeswax with essential oils when he was 8, just to make Christmas gifts on a tight budget. He gave me one that smelled like pine and burned too fast. I had kept the empty jar in a drawer for 20 years. Nina never asked where he learned. When the guest room needed redecorating for brand aesthetics, Gloria suggested painting over the mural I had hand-drawn during construction waves and stars, soft lavender tones. "It doesn't photograph well," she said. "Too sentimental." I stood there as she painted over it herself, her gold bracelet clinking softly as she moved. "Don't look so hurt," she said lightly. "The house belongs to the future now." David didn't meet my eyes. I stayed quiet. I told myself, "They're just details, walls." "Candles, branding, not love. Love can't be edited out of a photo, right?" But then came the garden. I had planted herbs along the back fence: rosemary, sage, thyme, the kinds David liked in his childhood soup. Nina dug them up, said she needed visual clarity for a hammock. When I asked if I could at least replant them near the tool shed, she smiled and said, "We'll have to see what aligns with our wellness themes." I don't remember what I answered, just that my hands smelled like earth all day. I tried to tell David. I tried to say it gently, nothing accusatory. Just, "I feel a little out of place these days." He reached for my hand. "You're overthinking it," he said. "You're always welcome here. Nina just has a vision, that's all. You know how she is, big dreams." Strong voice. I nodded. He looked tired. Maybe he didn't even believe what he said. Or maybe he needed to. For her, for himself, for the dream they were building. After all, hadn't I done the same, sacrificed pieces of myself for David's future, chipped off comfort to make space for growth? But there's something different about being invisible when you choose it. And when it's assigned to you. I kept coming back, kept cooking, kept fixing. Once, Nina had me taste a new kale soup on camera, asked for feedback from someone with a more humble palate. Her followers laughed. I laughed too, but something inside me curled, like a dry leaf in heat. And then, one afternoon, Gloria walked past me in the hall and said, casually, "You know, dear, if you really want to contribute, perhaps you should consider wearing something more neutral during live streams. The floral aprons are distracting." She didn't say it cruelly, just clearly, like someone editing a spreadsheet. And suddenly, I realized I was no longer a guest. I was no longer even family. I was part of the brand, but only in the blurry background. I wasn't banned from being seen. I was just slowly cropped out of every frame. It didn't happen in a storm, or a fight, or some cruel outburst thrown across a dinner table. It came in sunlight, clean and sharp, the kind that makes dust visible in the air, and truths impossible to ignore. It began when I told them, gently, over breakfast, that my position at the school had ended. "They're cutting costs," I said, stirring my tea. "I suppose it's a good time to slow down anyway. 65 feels like a nice round number." David blinked. Nina didn't. She looked at me over the rim of her glass and said, "Wait, you mean you're not working anymore?" I nodded. "Not for now. I've been thinking about retiring." She raised an eyebrow, a smirk twitching in one corner of her mouth. "Retire with what? Lillian? I mean, no offense, but you don't exactly have a pension or a portfolio." David cleared his throat, but she didn't stop. "You've always lived a bit hand to mouth, haven't you? That's not a judgment, just facts." I swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of lemon rind on my tongue. I said nothing. That afternoon, I brought up the loft, the one I had designed with a view of the sea and a built-in bookshelf for quiet days. "I could move into the cottage again," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "It would save money, and I could help around here, especially if the baby comes." My voice trailed off. Nina didn't look up from her laptop. "That loft's a studio now. I film there twice a week. And it's not soundproof. I don't think that would really work," David added. "We'd need to make some adjustments. Figure out logistics. Maybe short-term stays are fine." but not full time. The floor beneath me didn't shift, but something inside did. That evening, they filmed one of their live streams, the crosses unplugged, candlelight, acoustic guitar, sea breeze through the windows. Nina, glowing in her cream linen wrap, said sweetly, "We're so grateful for the people in our lives like Lillian. She's been part of our journey for so long. She's not really family, but she's always helped. She's kind of like a housekeeper/godmother." She laughed. The chat lit up. "So cute, can I hire one? She sounds lovely." And I, holding the tray of herbal tea I had prepared, stood frozen in the doorway. She had said it so gently, so publicly, with a smile, as if it was a kindness, as if I were a pet with a backstory. I had built this house. My hands had chosen every tile. I had poured the foundation, and now I was being offered a cameo. The next morning, Nina approached me with her planner open. "So there's a couple in New Glasgow looking for someone to help out light housekeeping, some cooking, occasional errands. It's good money. You could stay on the property, and there's even a garden." "Sounds right up your alley, doesn't it?" She said it like a gift, like an upgrade from whatever place she thought I came from. David stood beside her, saying nothing, just looking at me like he hoped I wouldn't make this awkward. "You want me to leave?" I said flatly. "We want you to be comfortable," she replied. "Too quickly. You're used to working. It's good to stay active." I turned to my son. "Do you think this is best?" He shifted, looked down, and then said, "It might be good for you. Mom, something of your own again. A chance to reset." I stared at the table, at the grain of wood I had sanded myself, and I felt a silence rise inside me so loud it nearly rang. "You know I gave you this house," I said. "The land, the money, all of it." Nina tilted her head. "And we're endlessly grateful. But gifts don't come with strings. At least, not where I come from." My chest tightened. "Where you come from," I echoed. She smiled. And there was steel in it. People don't linger after their role is complete. They move on, with grace. That night, I slept in the old workshop behind the main house. No one noticed. The next morning, I wasn't at breakfast, and no one asked. That evening, Gloria arrived loud, lacquered, perfumed. She swept in like she owned the air. "Oh," she said, seeing me through the screen door, "still here later," as I folded laundry. She walked by and dropped her words like sugar cubes into bitter tea. "It's time you made other plans, dear. This space. It belongs to the next chapter." I smiled, but my eyes didn't. I thought I was part of that chapter. She scoffed. You helped build it, and now it's built." I walked into my garden. The herbs I had planted years ago had been replaced with decorative grasses. The bench where David once sat as a teenager and told me about his first kiss was gone, turned into a filming set. The mural I had painted in the guest room, waves and wildflowers, had been painted over in matte beige. Too busy for brand shoots. Nina had said. I stood in the center of it, all the life I had poured myself into, and realized I was no longer invited to stay. Not because they hated me, not because I had failed, but because I had become inconvenient. The next evening, they launched a new content series, The Modern Family Blueprint. Gloria was featured in the teaser, along with David and Nina. I wasn't mentioned. My hands, the ones that had planted the trees, sealed the windows, stitched together love from wood and wind and worry. They had no place in the frame anymore. I went to my room, my new room, and sat on the edge of a bed that used to be his. I held a photograph of the house half built, back when it was only studs and hope. And I cried. Not loud, not long, just enough to remember I was still real. I wasn't thrown out of the house I built. I was rewritten into a role with no name. The days blurred, soft-edged and strangely hollow, like light filtered through sheer curtains no one ever drew open. I woke with the sun but was never greeted by it, not in words, Not in glance, not in presence. The kitchen, once my domain of rhythm and ritual, now felt like someone else's stage. I still cooked sometimes. Not because they asked, but because it gave my hands something to do, something to remember. The rosemary I snuck into the bread. The way David used to like the corners of his toast buttered twice. No one noticed. The meals were plated before the cameras, styled, posed, narrated, made with love, Nina would say sweetly to her followers, just like my mother taught me. Her mother, Gloria, sat proudly at the table, nodding like she'd earned the title. I stood by the sink, quiet, apron damp, unsure whether I was waiting to be thanked or just dismissed. There was no confrontation, no argument, just a silent agreement written in the air that I was not to be spoken to unless needed. One day, I came into the living room to find a framed photo on the wall, a family portrait, professionally taken, all warm tones and choreographed laughter. David, Nina, Gloria, the baby bump barely showing. I wasn't in it. The hallway held more of them, different angles, different poses, none with me, none even candid. It was as if I had never existed in this home beyond a helpful silhouette. I asked David about it once. "Oh," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We meant to include some of the older photos too. Just haven't had time." His eyes darted toward Nina, who stood nearby adjusting a vase. She didn't look up. That night, I sat alone on the back porch. The wind had shifted colder. I wrapped myself in a blanket I had quilted years ago, each patch sewn from pieces of David's childhood shirts. He used to call it the memory blanket. I didn't think he remembered that now. I watched as they filmed a new segment through the window, candles lit, theme music soft, everything curated. Gloria said something that made them laugh, and for a second, I saw the glow in David's eyes, the kind he used to reserve for me when he won his spelling bee or made his first clay bowl at school. Now, it belonged to another chapter. I was background, supporting cast, not even that an extra off-screen. Sometimes I wondered if I should speak up. But about what? About not being invited into photos, about not being named. It felt petty to say aloud, yet heavy to hold in silence. And then one morning, I walked into the kitchen and found a stack of printed cards on the table labels for the baby shower gift bags. One caught my eye, from the cross women Gloria, Nina, and baby-to-be. My name was not there. I picked it up, held it a little too long, then quietly set it back down. The next day, Nina asked if I could move my things from the hallway closet. "We're planning to shoot a house tour, and we need everything to be cohesive," she said. "We can set you up a little space in the shed. More neutral, like I was a misplaced color in their palette." That evening, I opened the shed and found an old chair, a box of tools, and the faded jar of beach glass David and I used to collect. He once said the blue pieces were magic like frozen sky. I held one in my palm and waited for the warmth to come. It didn't. Days passed. My name was no longer used. I became she, her. Could you let her know? Is she done in the kitchen one morning? I stood at the edge of the hallway while they planned nursery colors. David glanced in my direction, but said nothing. I thought maybe he would ask me to help. He knew I once designed children's spaces. I had sketches still, folded in drawers, but he didn't. Nina wanted Scandinavian beige. Gloria agreed. I returned to the shed without saying a word. I began sleeping there not because they asked, but because there was no more place in the house that felt mine. The bed in the guest room had been replaced with a crib. My boxes were tucked under a tablecloth. My toothbrush had disappeared from the bathroom. It was cleaner that way, easier. That weekend, I made dinner, a full roast chicken with lemon and thyme, just like I used to on David's birthday. I set the table. I folded napkins. I even lit the candles. No one came. They had ordered takeout and eaten on the porch during golden hour, filming a segment called Authentic Ease. I stood behind the door and listened to them laugh. The chicken sat untouched, cooling into silence. I wrapped it carefully and placed it in the fridge, though I knew no one would eat it. That night, I stood in front of the hallway mirror and looked at my reflection, and didn't see myself, just someone useful, quiet. Out of frame, I whispered aloud, just to remember the sound of my own name. Lillian. It startled me. They didn't tell me to leave. They just stopped calling me by name until I forgot I had one. I found it by accident, the way most truths wait quietly to be seen, not demanding, not hidden, just patient. I was in the shed that morning, folding old blankets, trying to make the space feel like a room instead of a holding pen. The wind had shifted colder. I was looking for the small heater I thought I'd stored in one of the plastic tubs years ago, when I came across a long-forgotten cardboard box sealed with yellowing tape. It wasn't labeled, just soft from time, corners sagging like it had given up waiting. I opened it with a small knife, and inside were rolls of old blueprints paper browned at the edges, curling from seasons of neglect. My heart paused. I reached in, fingers trembling, and slowly unrolled the top sheet. The lines were familiar, intimate walls and beams, measurements written in pencil smudged from my own hands. It was the original design of the house. The one I had drawn on evenings after school when David was still in high school, back when I kept all my sketches in a box under the bed labeled Someday. The details were careful solar placement, load-bearing notes, where the wind would cross from the cliffs in the summer. In the margin, a small ink stain blurred one corner. I remembered spilling tea on it in a rush to catch a train. But what stopped me, what took the breath from my throat and left me standing in cold air without a coat, was a sentence scrawled in sharp, teenage handwriting across the bottom of the page. Just a line. Nothing grand. But it felt like the sound of my own name after silence. To the only woman I'll ever build for, David, age 17. I sank slowly onto the floor, the paper trembling in my lap like it remembered me too. I traced the letters with my finger, gently, like they might dissolve if I pressed too hard. That year, he had made me breakfast on my birthday, burnt toast, jam in the shape of a heart. He had placed that blueprint in a folder and said, "This is your dream, Mom. One day I'll help you build it." And I had laughed, not knowing I would end up building it alone for him. I remembered the night I showed him the finished version of the blueprint, how his eyes lit up, how he said he loved the idea of a reading nook by the window, how we sat on the floor imagining what color the walls would be. That corner now held Gloria's yoga mat. I held the blueprint to my chest and closed my eyes, not to cry, not even to mourn, just to remember, just to feel something in my hands that hadn't rejected me. In that moment, I realized something quietly devastating, not that they had erased me, but that I had willingly let them. Every step I took out of the frame, every silence I held, every time I called it their house instead of our home, I thought I was giving them space to grow. But I was only erasing the last traces of the woman who once sketched dreams on napkins and turned them into shelter. I stayed there a long while, the morning slipping away outside the frosted glass. No one came looking for me. No one noticed I was gone. When I finally stood up, my knees cracked stiff from the cold, from age, from carrying too many moments like that one. I rolled the blueprint back carefully, tied it with ribbon, and placed it beside my bed in the shed. It wasn't a document anymore. It was a witness. I didn't need them to remember who I was. I just needed something in this house too. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with slammed doors or shouted truths or teary ultimatums. No one accused me. No one stopped me. Because by the time I decided to go, I had already disappeared in every way that mattered. It was a Tuesday, cloudless, ordinary. I remember the way the light fell across the porch like it had fallen 1,000 times before. But this time, it didn't land on me. I had become part of the shadows. That morning, I woke early, before the house stirred. I folded my blanket slowly, ran warm water over my hands, not because they needed washing, but because I wanted to feel something soft before I left. I sat for a moment in the workshop, sipping tea from the chipped mug that still held the faint scent of cinnamon from winters long past. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, just enough to lift the edge of the blueprint still resting beside my cot. It fluttered, that piece of my past, like it was urging me forward. I didn't pack much. One canvas bag, a sweater, the blueprint, a copy of David's birth certificate I had kept hidden in a folder marked important, though now I wasn't sure who it was important to anymore. A few photographs, the kind that never made it onto Nina's walls. I tucked them into a cloth pouch with hands that didn't shake. I moved through the house like someone who used to live there, not a thief, not a ghost, but someone who once belonged and knew she no longer did. The living room was staged with curated blankets and soft lighting ready for the next shoot. On the fridge, a new schedule had been posted in pastel ink. Filming times, room availability, chore zones. I didn't have a column. I wasn't part of the plan. I stood at the kitchen counter, wrote a note on the back of an old recipe card. Don't worry about finding me. I'm not lost. I just realized staying is not the same as being welcome. I didn't sign it. There was no need. My handwriting was the last part of me still recognizable in this house. I placed it beneath the salt shaker. Salt had always been my thing, how I preserved flavor, held memory. I walked through the hallway slowly, touching the frame of the nursery door, the edge of the stair railing, the coat hook where David once hung his backpack with a sticker that read, Space Explorer. Everything felt like it remembered me, but only faintly, like a perfume worn years ago. When I opened the front door, the hinges didn't creak. The world outside was still. I paused at the top step, looking out toward the sea. I had always imagined growing old here, trimming lavender by hand, painting by the upstairs window, reading to my grandchildren in the corner nook I had designed specifically for story time. But you can't grow roots in soil that keeps spitting you out. I walked the length of the path. I laid myself stone by stone, thinking of all the nights I rubbed balm into my knees after kneeling in the dirt too long. David had once asked why I didn't hire someone. I said, because this house needs to know my hands. At the edge of the property stood the gate. I had left it a little crooked on purpose. It made the wind sing through it in a way that reminded me of old music. I pushed it open and didn't look back. I walked, not quickly, not an escape, just forward. I didn't know where I would sleep that night, but I knew I wouldn't return to where silence had taught them how to live without me. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a notification from Nina's livestream account. We're live. I turned it off. I had no more use for the performance. That afternoon, I took the blueprint to the post office and mailed a copy to myself. I wanted it to arrive at wherever I would be next, not as a plan, but as proof. That once, I had created something beautiful. That once, I had been the beginning of something that mattered, even if I no longer had a seat at the table it had become. I didn't storm out. I didn't demand a reason. I just slipped through the door like air, because long before I walked away, they had already let go. I had only been gone for 3 days when the first message arrived, not from David, not from Nina, not from anyone who had set a place for me at their table in months, but from a man with a polished voice and a legal signature at the bottom of an email that read, Miss Lillian Cross, I've attached the updated documents regarding your interest in the reclamation of parcel #47A, the original land deed associated with the South Shore property. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. Then I remembered years ago, when I signed over the house to David and Nina, I had transferred the structure, not the land. I had kept the deed separate, not out of strategy, not as leverage, but because I hadn't known how to finalize it at the time. I had told myself I'd get around to it. that it wasn't urgent, that the paperwork would catch up to love. It never did. And now, that oversight, that tiny forgotten detail, the fact that the house stood on soil that still legally belonged to me, was the only thread left in my hands. The lawyer, a quiet man named Mark who had once helped me with my will, asked me if I wanted to proceed. I thought about it for a long time. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't rage. This was clarity. I wasn't trying to tear anything down. I was just no longer willing to let what I built be weaponized against me. I told him yes. 2 days later, a formal notice was delivered to David and Nina. By the time they opened the envelope, I was already settled in a small rental cabin 3 towns over, nothing fancy. Just clean and mine. I planted lavender in mismatched pots along the windowsill. I bought a teapot shaped like a cat. I stopped checking their social media, but word still found me. Monica, the young woman who worked at the local library and had once helped me print old invoices, ran into me at the farmer's market. "They're saying you're suing your own family," she whispered, wide-eyed, holding a basket of apples. I smiled gently. "I'm not suing anyone. I'm asking for what was never given, only assumed." And then, like truth waiting its turn, something else surfaced. A second envelope, thicker, handwritten, this time from the estate office of my late ex-husband. A man David had never truly known, a man who left when David was only 5 and never looked back. He had remarried, moved west, built a different life. I hadn't heard from him in over 2 decades, and yet, in this envelope was a will, and in that will, my name, not his children's, not his wife's, mine, to Lillian Cross, who raised my son when I could not, and who gave more than I ever could have. I leave the remaining portion of my estate because if there's anyone who understands the weight of unspoken sacrifices, it's her. I stared at the letter for a long time. There was a number on the page, a number that ended in 6 zeros. I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious. I felt vindicated, not by the money, but by the fact that someone who had once walked away had come back, if only in words, to say, "I see what you did." It wasn't the twist I expected. It wasn't even one I wanted, but it reminded me that not all erasures are permanent. Some names still find their way back into ink. I told no one. I didn't call David. I didn't send a message. I let the paperwork arrive like a tide against the sand, steady, inevitable. I didn't even need the money. I had lived on less my whole life. But now I had the means to reclaim what was mine, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I hired a new legal team, quiet, efficient. I asked them to initiate proceedings to take back the land if mediation failed. I offered terms, options, time. I didn't want to evict anyone. I just wanted acknowledgement that the ground beneath their feet had come from my hands, my name, my silent choices. That week, Gloria went on one of Nina's live streams. She didn't mention me by name, of course, but her words were sharp. Some people don't know when to let go. They cling to relevance like it's owed to them. True family rises together. Others just pull us down. I sat on my porch with my tea, listening not to her but to the birds, the wind, the quiet that didn't twist itself into performance. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I simply sent over a second document, a clause, a reminder, a quiet boundary, and then I walked out to the garden and planted rosemary. I wasn't tearing anything down. I was just finally standing on ground that remembered it was mine. It didn't happen all at once. The healing not in grand gestures or sudden clarity, but in the repetition of small, ordinary moments that reminded me I was still here, still whole, still allowed. The first few days in the cottage passed like a slow tide, not rushing in but arriving nonetheless. I moved through the space like someone who had lived in many places, but never quite been invited to stay. The cottage smelled like wood and dust and something faintly floral that reminded me of old linen pressed with lavender. The floors creaked in a way that didn't apologize. There were no curated shelves, no pastel calendars, no brand collaborations, no matching mugs lined up for the sake of aesthetic continuity. There was only space, and the air within it was mine. I began each morning by lighting the small stovetop and boiling water in a dented kettle shaped like a robin. I drank my tea barefoot, sitting on the porch, watching light stretch across the lake like it remembered my name. I wore the same cardigan 3 days in a row. I let my hair remain undone. I didn't smile at anyone unless I wanted to. And still, the sun rose. Still, the wind moved through the trees and didn't ask me for anything. I unpacked slowly. 1 bag, a few books, the blueprint, which I framed and hung above the fireplace not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. On the first real evening, I sat cross-legged on the floor with a pen in my hand and wrote down 1 sentence I was never lost. I was just waiting for the silence to end. I taped it to the window. The next day, I wrote another. A house is not a gift if you disappear from it. I filled the windowsill with herbs, rosemary, sage, mint, and watered them in silence. The cottage had a desk that faced the lake, and I began sitting there in the afternoons, writing things I never intended anyone to read. Fragments, memories, tiny pieces of the version of myself I had buried beneath other people's comfort. I wrote about the sound of David's laugh when he was 5, about the way I used to tie his shoelaces and whisper little poems as I knotted them, about the time I drove through a blizzard just to bring him soup and stayed the night in my car so I wouldn't disturb him. I wrote about my mother, how she once told me, "You can't be the roof and the floor. Choose where you'll be stepped on." I hadn't listened. I had tried to be everything, and now I was letting go. One afternoon, Monica from the library stopped by with a bag of old books and a pie. "You look rested," she said, gently. I smiled. "I'm not, but I'm real again." She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. The days grew longer, the nights quieter. I hung wind chimes outside, not the delicate kind that mimic grace, but heavy ones that sang low and deep, like thunder turned kind. I painted the front door a color I called grief blue. I didn't need a label from a store. I knew what the shade meant. On a shelf beside the window, I placed the ceramic owl David had made in kindergarten. One of the ears had broken off, but it still watched over me like it had something to say. Sometimes I stared at it and whispered, "I know, I know." There were no phones ringing, no filming schedules, no voices asking me to step aside, quiet down, be grateful. Just me, and the sound of a room that wasn't trying to impress anyone. When I walked barefoot across the floor, I didn't worry about leaving a trace. That was the point. I wanted to be part of something that didn't erase me as soon as I turned away. I began painting again, nothing that would sell, nothing for display, just color, just shape. I painted doors, dozens of them, some closed, some cracked open, some wide and glowing, and in one, I painted myself small, older, barefoot, holding a tray of lemons. But this time, I was looking directly into the room, not waiting for an invitation. One evening, a letter arrived in the post, no return address, no signature. Just a single sentence on cream paper. "We didn't know what we were doing. I hope one day you'll understand." I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it beneath the kettle. I didn't feel warmth. I didn't feel hurt. I just felt distance, the kind that protects instead of wounds. I wrote no reply. I had said everything I needed to in my absence. That night, I opened every window in the cottage and let the wind pour in. It smelled like pine and water and whatever forgiveness feels like when it has no audience. I lay on the couch and looked at the ceiling I hadn't built, in a house I hadn't gifted, and said out loud, "This is enough." And it was. The next morning, I woke early, walked out barefoot, and pressed my palm against the front door. The paint was cool, the wood steady, and for the first time, The name carved quietly into the side panel, Lillian C., felt exactly right. I didn't rebuild what they broke. I built something they couldn't touch, and finally, I stepped through a door that answered only to me. If you've ever stood at the edge of a room where you once belonged, if you've ever heard your name slowly vanish from daily conversation, replaced by silence or pronouns, or worse, by nothing at all, if you've ever reached for a door handle and hesitated, not because it was locked, but because you no longer knew if you had the right to open it, then I want to say this gently, and clearly you do. You have always had the right to step out, to start over, to breathe without permission. You don't need their blessing. You don't need their explanation. You don't need the version of you they tried to trim down to fit their narrative. If you gave your life to people who only took it as convenience, if you handed over your best years thinking they were investing back into love, and all they built was a world without room for you in it, then hear me now, you are not the villain in your leaving. You are not the failure in your exhaustion. You are not selfish for walking away from a table that used your hands to build it and still left your name off the guest list. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop begging for acknowledgement and start remembering yourself without it. You can wake up in a place that echoes only your own voice and call it enough. You can pour coffee into your favorite chipped mug and not wonder whether it photographs well. You can walk barefoot across a floor and not fear the creak beneath your step because no one is timing your presence or tracking your usefulness. And if you've been told that your absence is cruel, remember, your presence was never truly received. They didn't mourn you when you went quiet. They just filled the space with noise that forgot how to say your name. So